and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Stephen Cole. In this series, we speak to leading industry experts on current and urgent energy matters for the Foundation's members and the general public. Today, I'm going to speak to Dr. James Henderson. James is Director of the Natural Gas Programme at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and he will provide what I think is a world-class analysis on the most pressing issues facing the gas sector. So you don't want to miss this one. Dr. James Henderson, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us from what I'm sure will be a very insightful conversation.
Thanks, Stephen. Pleasure to be here on your podcast.
Well, first of all, I'd like to gather your thoughts on Arctic LNG. Do you see it as a major competitor for LNG in Europe and its flexibility to deliver eastwards? And secondly, will it really be a low-cost source of LNG, as is often claimed?
Okay, well, if we're talking about Arctic LNG from Russia, which I presume we are, because that's the major source of LNG, then the first thing to say is there is a huge resource base there. And the upstream side of that resource base is very low cost. I mean, very simple fields, very large fields, so lots of synergy benefits. And in terms of the cost of production of the LNG itself, the Russian government has been providing significant support. The tax rate is pretty much zero for Arctic LNG at the moment, and the government's been providing its support with infrastructure as well, because the Arctic is seen as a big geopolitical bargaining chip for Russia. So I think the combination of the large resource base, the government support, and the assistance provided by international companies such as Total has meant that Russian LNG from the Arctic is very competitive. On a full cost basis, delivered price to Europe's about $5 to $6 an MMBTU, a little bit more to Asia. On a marginal cost basis, much lower than that, down at sort of more like $2 to $3 an MMBTU. So yes, it is very competitive. If that government support was ever taken away, if taxes were imposed, then clearly the costs would go up. But given the geopolitical importance of the region and the Northern Sea route, I think that we're likely to see that support continue. So I would anticipate, one, it being competitive, and two, the volumes growing quite significantly over the next 10 to 15 years. And those volumes will be delivered to Europe, but I think increasingly to Asia. The main target market is Asia. As the Northern Sea route opens up, as temperatures start to melt the ice earlier in the year, I think we'll see more tankers flowing to Asia. Clearly, the Chinese market is a major target. So yes, I think Arctic LNG is going to be an increasingly dominant force in the LNG market as we go forward.
Well, you mentioned China there. In late 2019, the Russian pipeline to China, in quotes, the power of Siberia, began deliveries. There's now a second pipeline under study. Do you believe Russia has pushed this development under the belief the European gas market may perhaps dwindle because of competition from renewables, or is this project just an expensive political gesture?
So I think that there's a couple of two or three main drivers. One, clearly there's a political issue with Russian gas in Europe, and the Kremlin is not unaware of that. We've seen all the debates around Nord Stream 2 and security of supply issues, and questions about Russia's share of the European gas market. So I think they understand there's a limit to the amount of volumes they can push into Europe. Secondly, the point you've made about energy transition in Europe clearly is putting all hydrocarbons at threat. Gas may be a cleaner fuel to burn than coal or oil, but it's still a hydrocarbon. And the Russians understand that there is an increasing drive in Europe to reduce use of all hydrocarbons. So again, it's a limiting factor in terms of what gas they can export. So a natural response to that is to diversify your markets. And with Asia being the fastest growing gas market in the world, buying increasing amounts of LNG, it makes sense as well to try and sell it pipeline gas, particularly because Russia has some very large gas fields in the east of the country that haven't really got another market. The gas market in the east of Russia is pretty small. There's a fairly low population. It's sort of it's land bound, if you like. There's no real access to the sea from any of these fields. So pipelines are really the only answer, and the only big market in the region is China. So it made a lot of sense to offer this gas to the Chinese. Clearly, there's a political dynamic there as well. There's an element of showing the Europeans that you've got an alternative market. There's an element of sort of ganging up against the US, but there's also clearly just the commercial logic of selling your products to a fast-growing market. So no, I don't think it's an expensive political gesture. I think the economics and the politics of it are really largely driven by China. China's the market. When they need the gas, the pipeline tends to get built. So we had to wait an awful long time for Power of Siberia 1 to be built. It took about 14 years from first negotiation to finally gas flowing. And I think Power of Siberia 2, which you've alluded to, which is a pipeline from West Siberia down through Mongolia into northeast China, I think will also only happen when the Chinese really want it to happen. Gas demand in China is rising fast. The Chinese authorities like to balance imports against domestic production. They also like to balance the source of imports, LNG versus pipeline gas. And so I think when they feel that balance is requiring more Russian gas, they'll sign up for the new pipeline. I would anticipate that being sometime around the end of this decade. And so I wouldn't expect gas to flow until sometime in the 2030s. But I do think we are going to see Power of Siberia 2 at some point. And, you know, at that point, that the Eastern market will provide something of a balance for Europe. It won't be as big as Europe for Russia, but it will at least provide a significant diversification if, as expected, the European gas market starts to go into decline sometime after the 2030s.
And gas is coming under increasing scrutiny, not just political scrutiny. And I'm thinking perhaps of the election in Germany and possible green power, but because of methane emissions. Now, in the last 40 years of climate negotiations, the world, as you know, has focused intensely and rather exclusively on carbon dioxide. But this year, scientists are urging a focus on methane. And according to the latest UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, countries must make, quote, a strong, rapid and sustained reduction in methane emissions. So are the major gas producers doing enough to reduce methane emissions?
Well, the short answer to that is at the moment, no, they're not. I mean, methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. It has, on a 20-year life cycle, it has about 80 times the greater warming capacity than CO2. Over a 100-year life cycle, that falls to about 25 times. But nevertheless, it's a very, very important greenhouse gas that we need to control. And there is a lot of concern and a lot of criticism of the gas industry that across the gas value chain, emissions of methane really do undermine the case for gas. And so a lot of questions are being asked about how these emissions can be reduced. And well, actually, the primary question is, how big are these emissions? And I think one of the major issues with methane emissions is not enough work has been done to really measure how large they are, where they're coming from, and then how they can be reduced. The IEA has done some work to show that as much as half of all the methane emissions in the gas value chain could actually be brought down to zero at negative cost, i.e. the value of the gas that would be saved would more than make up for the cost of stopping the leaks. The major problem is monitoring the leaks, verifying them, and actually then reporting them accurately so that they can, we can measure what needs to change and where it needs to change. And a lot of criticism of the gas industry has really been around the lack of transparency on the leaks themselves and what's being done to solve them. And I think at the moment, the EU is talking about setting up an observatory to, if you like, create a database of leaks. It is threatening a carbon border, not threatening, it's going to impose a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically initially not targeted at the gas industry, but could easily be applied to the gas industry, so that unless you can demonstrate what the emissions are in your entire value chain and put a number on it, then they will just charge you an arbitrary tax. So there's a big incentive for the industry to try and sort this out. In some of the biggest areas of concern are, for example, the shale gas fields in the United States of America, where, to be fair, emissions are monitored quite accurately. But we've already talked about Russia. There's a big question mark about what emissions are in the Russian system. The Russians, not surprisingly, claim they're very low. Many are cynical about that. Getting the satellites in place, getting an observatory, getting a global database, these are all critical issues which really need to be addressed before we can get to the bottom of how big the issue actually is, never mind solving it. So to come back to your question, is the industry doing enough? No, it's not. And it needs to start by really defining what the emissions are, and then defining what actions need to be taken in fairly short order to reduce the emissions that have been identified, and then essentially having a process which can verify and report that those emissions have been reduced. So there's a process that needs to be put into place. We're at the start of having identified the problem. Now we really need to get on with putting that process in place as fast as possible. And the industry needs to play a very key role in that if it's going to justify gas's place in the energy system in a decarbonising world.
Interesting. Thank you, James. That's very good. We see many studies and proposals by fossil fuel producers aimed at promoting the use of carbon capture and its combination with natural gas to produce hydrogen. Do you think these are realistic and scalable proposals, or are they just attempts to preserve underground assets?
So it's a good question, and it depends. The answer to this question depends on your perception. So your last statement about attempting to preserve underground assets, a number of environmental NGOs would say that all attempts to reduce emissions from hydrocarbons are really just not really a solution to the problem. They're just a desperate attempt to keep hydrocarbons in the system. Having said that, the energy transition is by its very nature a transition. It is not you don't flick a switch and suddenly go from one system to another. And any of the analyses that you see of the transition over the next 30 years show a declining role for hydrocarbons, but nevertheless a significant role for hydrocarbons. And therefore, if we're going to meet net zero targets, we do need to work through ways that we can abate the CO2 from those hydrocarbons. And CCS, carbon capture and storage, and carbon capture utilization and storage is certainly one of those ways. So whether it's just abating the use of natural gas in industrial and power processes, or whether it is turning that natural gas into hydrogen, carbon capture and storage can play a role. Now, there is an issue in as much as the economics of carbon capture and storage are still expensive, and therefore the cost of adding abatement to industrial processes or creating what is known as blue hydrogen, hydrogen which is created by steam reforming of methane and then storing the carbon dioxide that is emitted in stores to create a low carbon hydrogen. These are all processes that we know work experimentally, theoretically, and indeed practically, but not yet at scale. And so, I think going forward, the need to scale up the use of carbon capture and storage and to scale up the production of blue hydrogen is something that, again, the industry needs to demonstrate. Now, there is an issue with this, and is that many policymakers see green hydrogen, hydrogen produced by electrolysis using renewable electricity and electrolysis of water using renewable electricity as the ultimate end goal. And indeed, that is, of course, the cleanest form of hydrogen. But again, this theme of transition comes back. The process of getting to green hydrogen, I think to start a hydrogen economy, we're probably going to have to start with the transforming of methane and using carbon capture and storage. So I think that they're going to be important if we're going to really have a hydrogen economy. However, the pressure is on to demonstrate that they can be done economically and that it can be done at scale. And again, we're sort of at the start of that journey, if you like. Companies are starting to put demonstration projects in place. We're starting to see people developing the technology to a greater extent and bringing costs down, but we're certainly not there yet. So it could be a very, very important sort of element of the transition, and certainly if hydrocarbons are going to continue to be used to any great extent over the next 20 to 30 years, it will be necessary, but we've yet to see the full proof that it can provide a solution.
Just briefly, I'm slightly cynical about the current trend for electric vehicles, electric cars. I think it could well be a major push by the motor manufacturers to sell new cars, personally, because electric vehicles have to run on electricity effectively. Is hydrogen, very briefly, James, a viable route for electricity generation?
Not. I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, hydrogen tends to be used as storage, as a way of. In the future, it's really seen as a way of storing renewable electricity. So when you have surplus renewable electricity in the system, if the wind is blowing hard or the sun is shining a lot, and you're in a time of lower electricity demand, then one thing you can do with your surplus electricity is electrolyze water, turn it into hydrogen, and then when the wind stops blowing, you feed that hydrogen back into a power station and generate electricity cleanly, because you've obviously generated the hydrogen using renewable electricity. So it's seen as a way of storing renewable electricity. I don't really think it's a primary driver in the power system. I think, renewable energy plus nuclear, hydro, wind, solar are seen as the key primary drivers of electricity, but hydrogen is seen as a potentially very good source of storage when you have surplus renewables in the system.
Got it. That makes sense. The IEA recently published its Road Map for a net zero world by 2050, called Net Zero by 2050, funnily enough, a roadmap for the global energy sector. And it calls for the end to fossil fuel investment. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this. What are your thoughts on the report?
So I think there's a couple of things to say up front. Firstly, the report very clearly states that it provides a pathway to net zero, not the pathway to net zero. So it is a demonstration of one way of getting to net zero, and it does not call for an end to fossil fuel investment. It says that under the pathway it has painted, there is no need for new fossil fuel investment. So that may sound like a nuance, but I think it's very important to realise that although the messages that are coming out from the IEA report are very, very important and do highlight the significant changes that are needed in the global energy system, I think it's important to realise, and indeed the UNFCCC reports and the IPCC reports clearly demonstrate, because they show 90 different scenarios, all of which kind of head towards the temperature rises that we're targeting, that there are many, many different scenarios that can be painted here. So I think my thoughts on the report are that it's a very important report, because it does highlight to policymakers the dramatic need for change and the dramatic amounts of investment that will be required. And it does highlight one way where we can head to net zero. But I think it's also important to realise that, in the net zero report, hydrocarbons, particularly gas, still play a relatively significant role. Carbon capture and storage plays a very, very significant role. And therefore, although we're talking about a decline in the use of hydrocarbons, which is clearly going to be necessary if we're going to meet our environmental targets, we're not talking about the dramatic ending of the hydrocarbon industry. And indeed, one of the big questions, I think, for the hydrocarbon industry is how much will need to be invested in existing assets just to maintain the amount of hydrocarbons that are required, even in the decline scenarios, because I think there's a risk, and in fact we're seeing it at the moment, of huge price volatility if the hydrocarbon industry stops investing too quickly, because we still do need oil and we still do need gas, and in Asia, to a large extent, we still do need coal for a period of time. We need to abate it as fast as possible, but we need to get the balance right. So I think, one of the things about the report is, although it highlights a lot of very, very important issues, and it's critical that policymakers understand these, we don't want to jump too rapidly, because we are in a transition. As I said, you can't just flick a switch. It's a transition, and we need to manage the decline of hydrocarbons and manage the abatement process, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you like.
Next month, I'm going off to Kazakhstan to talk green energy and various issues at the Eurasian Media Forum. And of course, one of the big questions is what actions countries like the USA and China should take to reduce their emissions. This will come up at COP26. So two questions in one, really. What do those countries need to do to reduce emissions? And how can you make them stick by promises made at COP26?
Well, the second question is a very difficult one, isn't it? I mean, obviously, we've been through the process of the stick, and now it's the kind of, getting countries to make commitments, and then, if you like, using the kind of embarrassment factor or the moral and ethical factor to kind of get them to stick to their targets. I mean, essentially, that's just a policy and political negotiation. In terms of the actions that are needed, I mean, I think coming back to that IEA Net Zero report, a lot of the actions were highlighted by that report. Clearly, but also I'd say that we also need to understand that countries are starting from very, very different positions. And so there is not one answer which fits all. So just to take a very example you've highlighted here, US and China. China's economy is dominated by coal. So the answer for China is very much a transition from coal to gas and then to renewables. So gas can play a very, very significant role in China in reducing emissions just by switching away from coal in industrial processes and in the power sector. In the US, that switch has largely happened already for economic factors as much as anything. The large amount of gas found in the shale beds brought the price of gas down and made gas more economic than coal. So for the US, we are talking about a switch to renewables away from all forms of hydrocarbons. The other thing for both economies, really for all economies, but particularly for the US economy, is efficiency gains and reducing the energy intensity of economies. And that is done in multiple ways, from the refurbishment of housing stock and buildings through to taxation policies, removal of subsidies, all sorts of policy measures that can be put in place to encourage consumers to reduce the level of energy that they use and to think more carefully about the way they use energy in a more efficient manner. So I think looking at that, I think, is also very important. But it just makes the point that as you look across the world, countries, even in Europe, for example, are starting from very different positions. Poland, for example, has a coal-dominated economy, whereas France has a nuclear-dominated economy, and the UK, has removed coal from its system almost altogether now because of a taxation policy which has encouraged the switch to gas. So you have to basically, when you're looking at the policies for different countries, you have to take those changes those differences into account. So, what actions need to reduce emissions? Well, I think generically a move away from hydrocarbons towards carbon-free energy sources, increasing efficiency, and policies in place to encourage consumers to reduce demand are generic things one can say, but each country is going to have to choose its own path given its own starting position.
Exactly. One size doesn't always fit all. Dr. Henderson, I unfortunately believe that's all we have time for today. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining me and providing the foundation with that excellent analysis. And I look forward to talking with you again. Watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. I'm Stephen Cole. Thank you and goodbye.